Welcome to FDOT's webinar on determining context classification. Overview. During this webinar, we'll be discussing what are FDOT's context classifications, how will the context classifications be used, how do you determine a context classification. We'll provide some case studies. We'll also provide some additional resources that you can consult for determining context classification. Part 1. What are the FDOT context classifications? FDOT's context classifications are a way of describing place, from the most rural conditions to the most urban conditions, with a range of urbanization in between. The ranges go from C1 natural to C6 urban core. We'll discuss each of these ranges. The C1 natural context includes lands that are preserved in a natural or wilderness condition, such as a state park or national forest, and these include lands that are unsuitable for development due to natural conditions. Maybe it's a wetland, could be a beach or a seashore, or a steep slope area. These are lands that are not intended for future development. The C2 rural lands include sparsely settled agricultural lands that may be fields or orange groves or other agricultural uses today. They may also be woodlands or wetlands that could be developed at some point in the future. The key difference between C1 and C2 is that C2 has the potential for future development. C1 does not. There's a special category for urban areas that are located in the middle of rural areas. In Florida, we call these a rural town, and they have the designation C2T, rural town. A rural town is a small concentration of a town area that's immediately surrounded by rural or natural areas. This includes many of the historic towns in Florida. As urbanization increases, we can expect to see the C3 suburban categories, and there are two, C3R and C3C. The C3R suburban residential category is mostly residential land uses with large blocks and a disconnected or sparse roadway network. These areas may be characterized by large housing developments, for instance, with very few shopping or mixed-use opportunities in between. They typically have large blocks and roadways that are optimized for high-speed design. We also have the C3 suburban commercial categories. These are also suburban in character, but are mostly non-residential uses. They have large building footprints and large parking lots on large blocks with a disconnected or sparse roadway network. These are what may be considered by some big box stores, big box retail stores. They typically have large parking lots between the building and the roadway. These areas are also typically optimized for automobile usage with minimal provisions for pedestrians, cyclists, or transit. As urbanization increases, we come to the C4 urban general category. This is the general urban fabric of most cities. It's not the downtown area, it's not the suburbs on the edges, this is the areas in the middle. In Florida, a lot of these communities were developed in the early 1900s or before World War II at least, and they are typically walkable. They have a mix of uses. Usually they will have small blocks, and we'll describe what a small block means. It also has a well-connected roadway network. It may have a grid or a warped parallel grid or some other type of networked street system. The roadway network usually connects to residential neighborhoods immediately along the corridor or along the back side of the blocks fronting the roadway. The C5 urban center context classification might be thought of as a downtown location or an urban location or the center of a small urban area. Typical examples might include downtown Gainesville, downtown Tallahassee, areas that are small towns but have a large urban center. The characteristics include a mix of uses set within small blocks with a well-connected roadway network. Usually you'll have these areas concentrated around just a few blocks and perhaps identified as part of a civic or economic center of a community, town, or a city. As you can see in the diagram, the buildings are typically located close to the street. Parking may be internal or may be along the street, or it may be structured parking. Our most urban conditions are the C6 urban core conditions. In Florida, these are only found in places with a population in excess of 1 million people. Many are regional centers and destinations. You'll know the C6 because they have the tallest buildings, they have the greatest density, they have a huge mix of uses, they're built right on the roadway, and they usually have a well-connected roadway network. There may be places that don't fit onto one of these context classifications. We call these special districts, and there is a provision for these within the context classification system. These are areas that do not adhere to context classification measures. They have a mix of users that can create unique travel patterns. Some examples include university campuses, airports, rail yards, shipyards, freight distribution centers, refineries, sports complexes. Those are just some examples, but you can see the common thing that all these areas have is that they are typically focused on a single type of use, and that use may be very specialized. Airports, for instance, have to receive aircraft, which is a very specialized type of use. Rail yards and shipyards are receiving very specialized modes. Freight distribution centers are concerned exclusively with the entering and exiting of trucks and getting freight moved around. So these are places that you typically don't have a wide range of uses, and they have a very specialized use. That's what makes them a special district. Part 2. How will context classification be used? What does context classification tell you about roadway users? The context classification informs planners and engineers about the type and intensity of users that can be expected along a roadway. For example, in the C4, C5, and C6 contexts, you can expect a higher number of pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit users because in these urban conditions, that's where transit works the best, that's where bicycling and walking trips make the most sense, and that's where you typically find the highest numbers of pedestrians and cyclists. On the other hand, in the C1 natural and C2 rural conditions, you would expect to see very little to no transit at all. You may see cyclists, but the only pedestrians you're likely to encounter are folks walking on a trail, but in general you don't have a lot of pedestrian activity in these locations. In the C3R and C3C, suburban residential and suburban commercial locations, you can have a mix. What we have here are landforms and transportation systems that were built around the automobile, but you have large numbers of people who also have to access these areas. And so you may have transit in these locations, and you'll probably have pedestrians and cyclists in these locations, but the landforms and the transportation system are not really optimized for transit or bicycle or pedestrian travel. They're optimized almost exclusively for automobile travel. So knowing that you're in these kinds of locations, C3C and C3R, can help you understand the challenges you might be facing as you're developing a project and needing to determine what the context classification is going to be. The C2T rural town is a special case where the rural town is normally located in the middle of a large rural area, and yet you have this small little town in the middle. The characteristics of the C2T rural town can be very similar to what you would find in a C4 general urban area. You'll have larger numbers of pedestrians walking. You may have on-street parking. These areas in C2T are usually only a block or two long, and they're usually historic towns, so they may have on-street parking. They may not have transit, but they probably will have pedestrians, and they may have cyclists there. So knowing where you are in space and what your context classification is actually begins to tell you a lot about what the space is that you're designing for or planning for, and what kinds of needs might need to be met in those locations. Relationship to the FDM. The FDM is the FDOT Design Manual. For non-limited access roadways, the FDOT Design Manual provides design criteria and standards based on context classification. You have to know the context classification in order to know what design criteria to use in the FDM. For instance, the FDM design speed ranges for non-limited access facilities, shown here, show the allowable design speed range based on context classification. If we consider at the top of the list here in C1 natural, you have high speeds, 55 to 70 miles an hour in these natural and rural areas, C1 and C2. Whereas in the C6 urban core locations and C5 urban center locations, where we expect high numbers of pedestrians and a lot of pedestrian activity and a wide mix of uses, we have much lower design speeds, 25 to 30 or 25 to 35 miles an hour in those locations. This is to allow the roadway to match the context where the roadway is found. At DOT, we call this putting the right road in the right place. Note that the minimum design speed for SIS is different than the design speed for non-SIS facilities. The strategic intermodal system is designed for freight travel and for high-speed travel for its context, and so what you'll notice here is that the design speeds for the SIS are at the top of the range essentially. For an urban core, it's 30, and in C5 urban center, it's 35, in C4, it's 45 miles an hour. In suburban locations, it's set at 50. This is a little less than the top speed, recognizing that suburban locations do also have a range of uses there. In the rural town, it's set at 40. There are provisions to go down to 35 if the area has on-street parking and other types of facilities that would require a lower design speed in those locations. That's something that can be done as a design exception. The FDM implementation schedule. The FDM will be effective January 1st, 2018, but there's a little more to it than that. The context-based design criteria in the FDM will be required on all projects that have not begun design by January 1st, 2018. For PD&E projects, the implementation of context classification and the FDM is required for all projects that have a public hearing scheduled in April 2018 or later. The FDM may be applied earlier at the discretion of the district. Who will determine context classification? District staff are responsible for determining context classification. The district can assign staff to oversee the context classification evaluation. It's recommended that multiple offices or groups be involved in this determination, as it will affect design, planning, operations, and engineering. On projects where FDOT currently coordinates with local governments, FDOT should continue to coordinate with local governments to calibrate the context classification. You can use local form-based codes and zoning to help inform FDOT's context classification determination. In any case, the final determination of context classification will always be made by FDOT. We reserve the right to determine context classification on the state roadway system. If your context classification may require a special district, you're thinking maybe a special district will be required in this location, you should coordinate with the state Complete Streets Program Manager. If you're working on a project that's on the SIS, then you should coordinate with your district SIS coordinator.